Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
First of all, of course, are witches. It is believed that there is at least one in every village. It is said that witches are usually dark-haired, with thick black eyebrows, with dark eyes. On the one hand, Ukrainians have historically had an obsession with dark-haired people. It was considered an ideal appearance, which was sung in songs: black eyebrows, dark eyes, and pale skin. On the other hand, it was believed that such people were prone to the evil eye and witchcraft, while blonde, fair-eyed people supposedly could not cast witches. It was not only ugly old women with a bad temper that Ukrainians considered witches. On the contrary, the image of the Ukrainian witch differed from the Russian Baba Yaga and was somewhat eroticized. It was believed that witches were very attractive and cheerful in their youth, and were in demand by the male sex, even without their classic beauty. Nevertheless, they rarely give themselves away, get married, as they were believed to cohabit with representatives of unclean forces. Weak spirits and demons serve the witch, and she serves the devils of a higher rank, and is forced to get involved with them in intimate relationships. Therefore, it was believed that born witches, not those who learned witchcraft, but those who were born with it, often had a blackish hair appearance, increased body hair and tails like a pig, because they were once born of evil spirits and have animal traits in them. Those who have sold their souls to the devil can have any appearance. And of course, people of Eastern origin, who are mostly dark-haired and dark-eyed and tend to have a lot of hair on their bodies, are not counted as witches. My aunt from the village told me that back in the days of the Soviet Union, when she was in school, they had a guy who got married down the street and then told everyone that his wife had a little tail, like a pig's tail. He asked her what it was, and she said, "We all have it in our family." However, no one was particularly surprised, because there were already rumors about this girl, that she was a witch. My friend, too, was born in the family with 4 nipples and a little tail. The obstetricians cauterized her extra nipples and tail, leaving only small scars on her body. Science calls this atavism, and it is believed that congenital witches all have this atavism because they were born of a connection with the devils. It used to be believed that witches steal milk, stars, and cast spells. Now it is believed that witches and witches sell their souls for riches. In our village, we have such families who are considered witches. They either got rich from nothing, or their daughters married very well. Girls who were not witches also tried witchcraft. Some practiced, for example, charms by putting their blood in food. I don't know how you cannot see someone else's impurities in your food, but one of our village's girls managed to bewitch a guy like that. Their happiness did not last long, and she was ill for a long time afterwards. Witches hold covens on bald mountains, the hills with flat tops, where they fly in on brooms or sticks. It is believed that the main coven is held on top of Lisa Hora in Kiev. Men feared that a witch would lay eyes on them, because witches sometimes flew to their covens not only on brooms, but also on their lovers, sitting on their backs and making them run faster than the wind. To refuse a relationship with a witch meant signing your own death warrant, and to marry her meant living your whole life in fear, riding her on her back and sharing her with devil lovers. This is why witches were often credited with having no legal marriage and a very riotous lifestyle with people and evil spirits. It was just as dangerous to refuse a witch's son or daughter, so an affair with a witch or her kin carried a tinge of hopelessness and humiliation. There are many stories of a young man walking alone in the countryside at night, being attacked by naked, loose-haired witches, mocked, beaten, forced to let her ride on his back, and in the morning he would come home in tears and with the skin of his legs peeled off from running. Witches attend church services, but if you look through the window at that time, you see that they stand with their backs to the priest, and those who are in the church will not notice it. But you can hear a witch quietly saying mean things about God and Jesus while the priest is conducting service. Also, a witch can be recognized by flipping a dooliu behind her back or in your pocket. That's what we call a fig sign. The Western equivalent is flipping someone off. When a witch passes by and you have a stick, she curls up, gets angry, It makes her physically uncomfortable. One woman in our street was walking by, and I put little hands in my pockets and twisted my finger. She passes by indifferently, and then I turn around and she's looking at me, spitting and cursing quietly, and her face is all red like she's in pain. By the way, that woman was dying, as a witch should, from very strong pains. From morning till night she screamed as if she was burned by fire, though she had no injuries or illnesses. When a person was dying, all the windows, doors, and gates should be opened, so the soul could leave the house easier. But that was not enough for a witch. She only died when her grandson took the roof apart. The whole street came to hear her screaming. They said she died only when they could see the sky through the hole in the roof, and they dragged her under the hole. And also it takes witches several days to die, and they may seem to be dead, and their heart stopped, when suddenly she comes to life and again begins to scream. It is necessary to bury a witch face down so that she would not come out of the grave after death. It was said that it was impossible to truly kill a witch, so the Ukrainians did not have much of an inquisition. There were cases of lynching, where the suspects had their hands and feet tied and were thrown into the water. It was believed that the innocent would go to the bottom, but the witch would not drown and would remain on the surface of the water. But in general, even after such a thing, the witch was not usually killed. The village just tried to stay away. However, there were legends that you could kill a witch if you stabbed her shadow with a knife. It was also believed that a witch was defenseless when she turned into something. There are stories of the wheel itself rolling down the street, or a ball of thread, or a strange animal running around. And it is actually a witch who has turned. And if you heard it, you cripple the witch. There is a story that guys and girls gathered on a holiday. They saw a huge melon appear from nowhere. So they grabbed it and threw it off the porch, and it began bleeding. They looked and saw a dead woman lying there with her head cracked open like a melon. It is also believed that witches gather on pear trees, especially large and old ones. My grandfather once told me that when he was young, he was cleaning the barn, stayed out late into the night, went home after dark, and the old women, who can hardly walk during the day, climbed somehow high up on a pear tree, sitting on the branches and laughing at him. In general, pear and willow trees were considered cursed trees. It was said that devils live in them, and even sitting under such trees is undesirable. As for the witches' animals, they were usually frogs, dogs, snakes, black cats, and of course, pigs. Generally, among Ukrainians, the pig was a cult animal. On the one hand, in times of constant Tatar raids, the Tatars took away all livestock except pigs. Therefore, there were times when only pigs were fed, and some even nailed pig heads at the entrance to the yard or house, so that the Tatars were disgusted and stayed away. And even some Ukrainian dishes such as lard, salted pork fat, and krovianka, pork intestine filled with fried pork blood, hints that such recipes were invented not from the good life, but at the time when in the food was used everything possible. But on the other hand, the pig was considered a terrible and unclean animal. Devils had pigs' features, witches had pigs' tails, and were said to turn into pigs. There are plenty of legends where a man is attacked by a huge pig. He injures it, for example, by cutting off an ear or a foot, and the next day a certain local woman also suddenly finds herself with a severed ear, or without a foot. There are enough horror stories without legends. In our village a couple of years ago, there was a case where a drunken man was passed out and pigs ate his face, nose, ears, lips. If we're talking about Tatar raids, which were an integral part of Ukrainian history, the following legend is worth telling. Once upon a time, there was another village on the place of ours, and the Tatars attacked it. They robbed it, left, and took the local beauty Galia with them. They took her to the forest, mocked her in a regrettable way, then hung her from a tree by her hair and left. They say they saw her up in that tree for years, swinging, crying, singing, and laughing, tied by her hair. But in general, Ukrainians did not particularly believe in ghosts, so most likely this is a true story, which was later superimposed on the legends about mermaids. Our mermaids, the Rusalka, did not have fishtails, lived in the forests and near the ponds, looked like children or young girls, pale and in white robes, who played by the water or swayed on the branches, laughed and sang songs. Their distinctive feature was their long flowing hair. It was not customary for us to dress like that before. Our women used to braid their hair and cover their heads after the wedding. There were also Mavkas or Mavkas. They looked like youth, naked or in white robes, led round dances in the forests and fields, and from a certain angle of view, one could see that their insides were visible. Some people believed that dead children and youth become Mavkas and mermaids, while others said that this is just a separate species of life on Earth, similar to people, but close to the other world. Then there were the woodsmen, or forest dwellers. The woodsmen were described as tall and thin people with very pale faces. The woodsmen, as the name implies, lived in the forest, had a separate language and laws of their own, and were a life form similar to humans, but still not human. They could lead a man into the woods, could on the contrary lead him out, and sometimes asked for help themselves. There is a story about a crying wild forest woman who ran into a man's yard and began to beg, "Help, help, hide," and hid behind a barrel. After her, the woodsman ran in and shouted, "Where is my wife?" He found her behind the barrel, grabbed her leg and yanked her so hard that he tore the forest woman in half. She must have been guilty of something. Changeling stories are closely related to mermaids. It was believed that mermaids would steal a newborn and replace him with their cub. Such a cub will immediately start talking, or, on the contrary, will never start at all, would eat a lot and grow beyond a normal size. It will not have a completely human appearance. For what purpose the mermaids did this is not known exactly, but for some reason they had a weakness for human children. According to some legends, this is how they replenished their ranks. Often in Ukrainian beliefs, there was a motive of intimate relationship with evil spirits, for example, devils. There are many legends of girls who stayed out all night and returned in the morning weeping and torn up, starting to get very sick and eventually dying. When the devils turned into human beings, they would cunningly seduce the girls, or force them to become their mistresses. And in the end, the poor girl's fate was deplorable, this connection almost always leading to death. There are also legends of how girls got pregnant by the devil and ended up giving birth to a broom or a ball of snakes, or their stomachs would burst and end up filled with tar or just empty. It was believed that an especially great chance to become devil's mistress was a woman who was picky and proud, who had stayed too long as virgins, or one who was tormented by her lover, who had abandoned her or died. A man who suffered for a woman also had a chance to become a victim of an evil spirit, which would go to him, turning itself into his beloved, and gradually bring him to illness and death. It was also believed that devils would take witches and girls who wanted to self-terminate as their wives and hold weddings with them. There is a story about a musician who was invited to play in a wedding, and the bride was his fellow villager, who had recently hanged herself. And he played and played, and then the rooster sang. Everyone disappeared, and he found himself sitting in a field at night, with no one around. In the past, there was the Vechornitsi, where young people from various villages gathered, danced, and sang, and that is how they got acquainted. There's a story where a girl meets a guy and an affair begins between them. When he asks her to marry him and takes her to his house, it turns out that his house is a cemetery, and that he himself died long ago. It used to be believed that if someone died young before marriage, then after death he would become an evil spirit, and would look for a mate among the living, and also bring him to his grave. There are also legends of love affairs with woodsmen. There are stories of girls being kidnapped by forest lovers, or vice versa, of a forest maiden or a Rusalka mermaid falling in love with a man and marrying him. In such marriages, the woodsman or maiden would often be unhappy and cry, but could not leave if her husband hid from her the cloak she had come in. It was believed that she would calm down if she converted to Christianity and give her a name. Generally, mermaids and Mavkas were the souls of girls and boys who had died before marriage, so they were very eager to have relationships with people. To die unmarried was tantamount to dying unbaptized. Such people have not fulfilled their purpose, so could not rest. The basic instinct drove them into the world of the living to find a pair. That is why we still often bury girls who died before marriage in wedding dresses, so she could get married in the next world. Despite their love affair with people, the forest women and mermaids were considered evil spirits, dangerous for man, able to lead him into the woods, drown him, or tickle him to death. On certain days, one could not go near a body of water, because mermaids would come out of the water and could take or drown a man. When he died, he too became a Rusalka. Forest dwellers could also come to people in the guise of their beloved, but not for the purpose of killing you, but to take you to the forest to become one of them. However, there are beliefs that this is essentially the same thing, because one could become a mermaid or a forest dweller only after death. If they call your name at night, you can't go. It's them who call. Even if you can return from them afterwards, you won't live long afterwards. A Sheznik is also like a woodsman. He leads a man into the forest so that he stays there. It is said that there are places in the forests where all sorts of things appear and then disappear again. Szczeznik from the word szczezati, to disappear. People in the woods see scary or strange creatures, funeral or wedding corteges, fires. They see or hear their relatives and children. They say that if you are walking in the forest and hear someone you know calling you behind your back, crying, asking for help, or even as if someone is chasing you or the forest is on fire behind your back, do not turn around in any case. Go your own way. This is how the Szczeznik tries to lure you, to drive you into the thicket of the forest, so that the forest dwellers will take you away. Often with Szczeznik is associated with such common Slavic concept as blood. When a man is whirling in one place and cannot find the way, the blood makes his head spin and drives, and he does not understand where he is. And when the roosters start to sing, the blood disappears, and it turns out that the man was very close to home. Cases of death caused by evil spirits were also often associated with delirium tremens, aka white fever, aka drinking yourself to death. Many who encountered this phenomenon said the same thing, that they see devils, pig-like, with hooves that persuade them to kill themselves. Some alcoholics obeyed, hung themselves, or drowned themselves. My father talked about a similar phenomenon after an operation. It was very difficult for him to come out of anesthesia, and he saw a devil running around his bed and saying, "Die already, die, die." Of course, both alcohol and anesthesia introduce a person into an altered state of consciousness, but nevertheless it is interesting that many people have seen something similar. Self-termination was considered a grave sin. In our village on the street, a man got into debt, could not pay it off, and hanged himself. After his funeral, such a strong storm arose that the roofs of some houses were torn off. Moreover, the storm raged only on our street, and the rest of the neighborhood was unaffected. They say that if you bury a hanged man in a cemetery, a storm will begin. And if you bury a drowned man, there will be a drought. And the storm starts, because the devils come for the self-terminated and drag him around the whole village as a prize. That is why the devils incline people to witchcraft and self-termination, in order to drag them into hell in this way. The Potochata should also be mentioned. Potochata are the souls of infants who died unbaptized. They crawl around on the ground, crying and unable to rest. If you hear crying but do not see the child, then it is a Potochata. It is necessary to throw him a cross or a piece of cloth and say any man's name, if a boy is crying, or a woman's name, if a girl is crying. In this way, the Potochata will be christened, receive a name, and can rest in paradise. If no one baptizes the Potochata in 7 years, he will become a Mavka. There are many legends where the mother went to the forest or river to find Mavkas or mermaids, and see among them her child who died at birth. There are also stories of giants. We call them Veletni. We have preserved a large number of burial mounds, huge graves the size of several houses, and cromlechs. Cromlech is a circle of stones, so large that it is not known how people moved them in general, and where they got them from. Mounds and cromlechs gave rise to legends about giants who supposedly lived before us. The most common legend is that one man was plowing a field when a giant came out from behind the Dnieper, took a man, his horse, and a plow and put him in his palm. He took him to his house and showed it to the giantess, his mother, and she ordered, "Take him back. He is also a man. After us, people will be so small." Similar stories are found in many nations. Ukrainians do not particularly believe in ghosts, but they believe that a deceased person could be seen within 40 days after death near their home, or somewhere in the surrounding area, like the soul passes by its home for the last time before leaving this world. But if a woman was very hurt by the death of her husband, a spirit would begin to visit her under the guise of the ghost of the deceased, and enter into a relationship with her and thereby destroy her. Or if the mother died and the baby remained, she can come to him after death, because he does not want to let her go. But it was believed that these were not ghosts, but evil spirits disguised as the deceased. They will call a person at night with the voice of the deceased, call him to her, persuade him to self-terminate, telling how good it is there. In general, it was believed that one should not cry a lot for the dead. The dead must come to terms with their fate, and if they see that relatives are suffering for them, they worry. They cannot find peace. About 10 years ago, a friend from the Donetsk region buried her daughter. She was very hurt. As a result, her daughter appeared in her dreams in a wet dress and said, "You cry so much that my dress does not dry out, so I cannot rest." There is an opinion that Ukrainian culture is matriarchal. In fact, this is not quite correct, but Ukrainians did not have such a pronounced patriarchy as other nations. In general, the question of gender equality did not exist in our country. The woman was not perceived as something cardinally different from the man. However, there is a tradition that long ago, back in the days of the very first paganism, when there was no Perun, Svarog, etc., our ancestors lived a matriarchy and believed that God is one and he is a woman. This is allegedly proved by female figures from the times of Tripoli, as well as by stone women. Stone idols in the form of women, which have been preserved in our country since ancient times. There are even legends of Sarmatians, female warriors who lived such a rigid matriarchy that they could kill their husbands for any fault. When a Sarmatian woman was born, her right breast was allegedly burnt, so that all her strength went not to her milk, but to the hand in which she held her sword. According to Ukrainian legend, women used to rule here, but they ruled badly, were cruel and tyrannical, and offended men, so the matriarchy ended. However, traces of this ancient belief are still preserved to this day. Folk songs glorify the Mother Earth. The earth beneath our feet is supposedly her belly, which gave birth to all mankind and gives birth to crops every year. Spitting on the earth or otherwise insulting her was a sin. Bereginya, the female deity who protects our people, is still mentioned. With the advent of Christianity, her image merged with the image of the Virgin Mary. In people's everyday life, echoes of matriarchy consisted in the relatively high status of women. Women often chose their own suitors and had equal rights with their husbands in the family. The larger the dowry a girl paid to her husband, the more power she had as a result. A girl with a small dowry might be oppressed, but a rich daughter-in-law became the rightful mistress, and neither her husband nor her parents could say a word to her. Girls also frequently practiced premarital sex in a light form, and of course pregnancy outside marriage and adultery were frowned upon, but not punished as severely as in other nations. As for domestic violence, it was mutual. There were husbands who beat their wives, but there were also wives who did not hesitate to take up the rolling pin and frying pan. There are many stories of women who cunningly killed Tatars, who entered their homes to rob them. Magic was also usually practiced by women. Even non-villains were active in the practice of witchcraft, fortune-telling, etc. There are even stories that a girl could come to the house of the guy she liked with her things and stay there. He had no right to kick her out, so she was considered his wife. This was usually practiced if a guy promised to marry, but was in no hurry to keep his promise. To this day, the Virgin Mary, has a very high value among older women, and is sometimes even placed above Christ, because she gave birth to him. In general, when compared with other nations, the morals of the Ukrainians were quite free. But at the same time, the connection between the godfathers was considered very terrible. The godfather is the one who christened your child. If one person baptized the child of another, they were considered relatives. Despite all sorts of playful sayings such as, what a godfather was not a godfather, marriage between godfather's family was severely frowned upon. It was equated with incest. It was believed that sick children were born from it. In Soviet times, a family from western Ukraine came to our village. They were married cousins and fled their home village because of the condemnation. Here they too were received coldly. They had a seriously ill child, cerebral palsy or something similar, who was both physically and mentally handicapped. He lived for about 10 years, then died, followed immediately by his parents, even though they were still very young. So the omen that cousins should not marry came true. In general, Christianity in our villages is closely intertwined with paganism. There are a huge number of traditions and superstitions of an unclear origin. For example, on the day of the beheading of John the Baptist, one should not cut round things. One should not perform many actions after sunset, such as sweeping and so on. There is also a rule that one should not keep the gate open. It is for the dead. Recently there was news that a neighbor had died, and his grandmother said, "Immediately close all the windows and doors of the house." And she went to close the gates and all the gates in general, even the gates to the garden and to the chicken coop. And the wife of the deceased, on the contrary, opened all the windows, doors, and gates, so that her husband's soul could fly away easier. It is believed that if someone nearby at this moment will have windows or gates open, the soul of the deceased may mistakenly fly in there and take someone with it. They should keep everything closed until the deceased is buried. Even the windows should not be opened for air. He died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I look. All the clocks in the house are stuck on that time. My grandmother says that when a dead person is around, everyone's clock stops at the time of his death. It's normal, and they'll leave by themselves afterwards. But I think the most beautiful belief is the story that at the bottom of the Dnieper River is a copy of our village. It used to stand on the spot of our village, but there was a certain natural cataclysm. The Dnieper went out of its banks, and in one day, it all went under the water. They say that houses and whole streets still stand there at the bottom of the river, and our village was built under the same plans. The streets were laid in the same way, so we got two identical villages, one on land and the other in the water.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.